Welcome to the second video on the Fallout Bible. The Fallout Bible series is an attempt by me to make the information in the Fallout Bible more accessible. So if you have never read it, or have not read it for a long time, then this is the perfect opportunity. If you missed the first video, definitely watch it, as all later Fallout updates build on the ones that came earlier. This video is covering the second and third update, because the second update is very short. With them both combined, however, there is a lot to get through, so we are not going to spend any more time on this intro. February 2nd, 2002, the second installment of the Fallout Bible was released. It starts with a foreword where Chris gives some information regarding what to expect in the third entry to the Fallout Bible, including an amended version of the Fallout timeline. He thanks everyone for sending in corrections and the supporting screenshots or other proof for the corrections. He then states that this is not a full update, but he will provide some corrections for the first installment. This is the reason why the second installment is so short. It was never meant to be a full entry. Chris then gives an email where he asks people for books or movies that might have interesting material relating to the Fallout genre. By Fallout genre, I guess he means post-apocalyptic, but maybe he means retrofuturistic, or perhaps some combination of post-apocalyptic and retrofuturistic. It is not very clear. He then says that suggested material for future Bible entries would have to involve Fallout events, but he won't provide walkthroughs, tech support, or questions outside of Fallout and Fallout 2. Fallout Tactics released in March of 2001, and Chris was not involved with the development of that game in particular. His willingness to only talk about Fallout and Fallout 2 may be chalked up to this fact, or perhaps he himself was not sure of the canonicity of the spin-off title, and therefore unwilling to talk about it. Another possibility is simply that he had no familiarity with the game and was unwilling to make it a part of the Bible because of the needed extra verification he would need to do to confirm the veracity of the lore. The next section is a question-answering section, and the first and only question is as follows. I read the start thing of the Bible that's on the net. One thing I don't agree with in the Fallout universe is that the vaults were just a bunch of social experiments. I mean, why? Period. Even though the Enclave were a bunch of assholes, why would they want to purposely see their own countrymen die when the vaults were society's last chance at a good survival? I like to think that lots of people died because the vaults just didn't work. Like in Fallout Tactics, there's a terminal that says the money had been diverted from much needed common sense things to an underground game hunting facility or whatever it was. Experiments was a bit over the top, but corruption is far more believable. That's what I think anyhow. And Fallout 3, is it a possibility or not? I don't mean to poke fun at anybody's ability to write in correct English, but I can't help myself sometimes in reading how it is actually written. Chris's answer is, the vault experiments were an idea created by Tim Kaine, and I don't really know the reason behind them, but I can offer some speculation. First off, thematically, it's pretty creepy, and we all know that developers will put all sorts of crazy shit to try and mess with their players' heads. It's possible that Tim had just finished watching an X-Files episode and had conspiracy theories swimming around in his subconscious. As to your comment about the experiments being a bit over the top, well, yeah, we're guilty as charged. Secondly, as proven time and again in Fallout 2, the Enclave isn't a particularly rational bunch of fellows. Thematically, they embrace a paranoid view of the world and a heightened sense of superiority over everyone else in Fallout. Third, the federal government, or whatever branch of federal government was responsible, it was not necessarily the Enclave, may not have ever considered the vaults as society's best chance for survival. The government may have considered themselves the best candidates for rebuilding the world and already had their asses covered in the event of a nuclear or biological war, by relocating to other remote installations across the nation, and elsewhere, that weren't necessarily vaults. The Enclave certainly didn't seem to be devoting much effort to digging up any other vaults and trying to use the human stock there to rebuild civilization. Fourth, a lot of people did die because the vaults didn't work. Some suffered worse fates. Nonetheless, even members of the Enclave probably could not answer the question of who created the vault experiments and their reasons, as many of the people responsible for the creation of the vaults died long ago, and many records were lost in the Great Static of 2077. President Richardson was familiar with the purpose of the vaults, but he never saw them as more than little test tubes of preserved humans he could mess with. So Chris didn't even acknowledge the question about Fallout 3, which, at this point, was in development. He also does not give a definitive answer to what I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the Fallout series, that many vaults had a more sinister purpose that often had very unexpected consequences. Chris makes it seem like Tim Kaine was the sole or main reason that vault experiments exist in the first place. At this point in the Fallout franchise, all that was known was that many of the vaults were experiments, but it was never explained why. It was during the development of Van Buren that the developers put together a more detailed plan of the Enclave escaping Earth to rebuild, using their advanced technology and data derived from the vault experiments. Chris goes on to provide 2 updates, the first of which is about Frank Horrigan. Horrigan update. Just to clarify, Horrigan is a mutant, but Horrigan was a monster before his exposure to FEV in the military base. He had many psychological problems, which may be included in a Horrigan psychological profile in the future. It's important to note that Horrigan has never considered himself a mutant, only the scientists at the Enclave would consider him one, but they mostly referred to him as an experiment, and even then, not to his face. Most soldiers considered Horrigan a walking nuke, something the tech boys built, and they were not generally aware of his mutant status. Most did consider him a freak, however, and there were few soldiers who wanted to accompany him on missions. Horrigan has always been loyal to the presidency, to the Enclave, and the armed forces. This loyalty was present before his exposure to FEV, and it was reinforced by presidential directive, through various conditioning and testing programs developed by the Enclave. Horrigan's low intelligence, which was further damaged by the FEV exposure, made these conditioning programs take root easily. So we don't know what questions prompted this, but it seems like many have been attributing all the terrible traits of Frank Horrigan to the experiments done by the Enclave, perhaps saying that he was a victim. As Chris very clearly states that Frank Horrigan was a pretty terrible person before the experiments and had serious psychological issues. Obviously, mental or psychological issues do not make someone a bad person. In this case, it seems to have amplified his already deplorable personality. The second update is about Wanamingos. Sorry about the error on the Wanamingos and sterility. I had forgotten about the mother and the eggs in Redding. In any event, to clarify, the eggs you see in Fallout 2 are the last generation of Wanamingos to exist in the wasteland. The young Wanamingos seen in Fallout 2 will perish in 5 years, and their parents a few years before that. An internal genetic clock will simply stop ticking, and they'll fall over dead. The Wanamingos are a vicious mutant breed that had their moment in the sun, and now their sun has set. To put the tombstone on their extinction, the largest known nest of Wanamingos were wiped out when the great Wanamingo mine was reclaimed by Redding with the help of a traveling tribal. The mother was killed, and the last remaining eggs were hunted down, stepped on, and then the remains were examined by local scientists and doctors who came to the extinction conclusions mentioned above. Again, Wanamingos are not aliens. They are a curious mutant or genetically designed fighting machine that has only been able to find a home in the cold, dark places of the wastes. It is possible that the Wanamingos were old Enclave experiments, or even experiments from before the Great War. And if this is true, then it's likely their genetic/biological dead man switch was purposefully engineered to keep them from breeding past a certain generation. As a final note, this is strictly a personal decision on my part. If you want them to live for fanfiction, pen and paper role-playing, campaign purposes, or for your own peace of mind, feel free to have some of them survive the stopping of their genetic clock. In the Black Isle universe, however, the little buggers are already dead, and their irradiated shells are scattered along the floor of abandoned mines throughout Northern California, where they make nice crunching noises when you step on them. Here we have Chris doing one of many corrections that we will see over the course of this series, this one relating directly to Wanamingos. The error here being that he had previously stated that Wanamingos were sterile and therefore would die out as a species. To counter this, he is very insistent that they have a very rigid and dependable biological clock that once it reaches the metaphorical 12th hour will cause all living Wanamingos to die. I find it interesting that after so many biological experiments undertaken by the Enclave, that this one would go off without a hitch. I showed you the Fallout 3 Wanamingo concepts, and I think having it return as a wasteland creature would be a cool idea. That is the end of the second Fallout Bible entry, and its short length is the reason why it has been lumped together with the third update, so you guys didn't wait all these weeks for an 8-minute Bible video. The third update was released on February 11th, 2002. Chris kicks it off with a series of short messages that are part of the foreword that is part of every entry. He starts by asking all translators who are working on translating the Bible and the timeline in particular to hold off until the next timeline entry, as he anticipates a number of changes to be made and doesn't want them to waste the time they are volunteering for the Fallout fanbase. He gives a brief summary of all the content in this update, including a revised timeline, discussion about Psykers from the first Fallout, keywords you can say to the talking heads of the first Fallout, among other things. He reiterates some of the same points from the previous updates forward and adds that he is wanting some 50s style music as theme music for a pen and paper Fallout game he is currently running at work. He then recommends a pen and paper game developed by a fan for those looking for more Fallout styled games. I clicked on the URL provided by Chris, and unfortunately, it is dead, but it is available for $2,000, so there's that. Chris then mentions that there is some unique concept art included in this update that I will show. The next section is a Q&A, starting with the first question. Here's a question that everyone would like to have answered. Why is Lynette such a bitch? Is she a jet baby? Was she abused as a youngster? Did she have a series of sordid love affairs that all went horribly wrong and warped her into a domineering cynic? Or she just acting like a typical Vault City citizen? As a reminder, Joanne Lynette is the first citizen of Vault City and is not a popular figure among the fanbase, because of her elitist and often demeaning interactions with the Chosen One in Fallout 2. Answer: yes, Lynette is a bitch if you're not a citizen. As the figurehead for Vault City, she was supposed to embody the worst arrogance and condescension that Vault City has to offer, traits that are not present in all citizens, as McClure and others prove. Furthermore, I suspect that she was made a black character to add an additional edge to her hypocrisy over slavery, but I guess you'd have to ask the original designers about that. Mark O. Green and I wrote Lynette's dialogue, but we were working off of an older design that, I think, Jason Anderson had written. As for why Lynette's a bitch, well, Lynette does have an extreme managerial, economic, and efficient soul, and she's used to getting her way. She wasn't abused, tortured, or twisted in any way when she was young. She just got a certain privilege and superiority complex hardwired into her head around 5 or 6 years old, and she's never been the same. She has always known that she was destined to lead the Vault 8 citizens, and that power has gone to her head. She's been the leader of Vault City for many, many years, and she's seen the worst that the Wasteland has to offer. But rather than taking sympathy on the poor souls that have come to Vault City for protection, she has instead taken the view that these Outlanders were simply not strong or smart enough to achieve what Vault City has, and thus are inferior. She tends to work too much and too hard, and she sees all her time as precious, so she has little patience for socializing without purpose, i.e. if it doesn't involve politicking, she's going to be working late at the office instead, or for people dropping in and wasting her time. As expected, Lynette has no positive romantic relationships, up until her potential relationship with Weston from NCR in the endgame of Fallout 2. She's had little time for anything other than her job, and that's her focus. If anyone throws her job or decisions into question, buckle up, because she takes it as the worst sort of personal attack. Lynette uses any negative situation involving Outlanders to reinforce her beliefs and disregards or ignores any positive aspects. She's single-minded and set in her ways. The fact that she and Vault City had an environmental welcoming mat stretched out for them, with the Gek, when they emerged from Vault 8 meant that they suffered little hardship in comparison to other struggling communities. But this simply doesn't factor into her thinking. She believes that Vault City and the Vault citizens have survived and thrived because they are a superior breed of human, smarter, better, and more capable than the human trash that prowls the wasteland. Anyway, there you go. Chris lays out pretty plainly that Lynette is a product of the elitist and racist underpinnings of Vault City, that is made even worse by her egomaniacal personality. I find this comment about why Lynette was chosen to be represented as a black woman kind of interesting, and I can't say that I ever got that impression when playing the game. The next question is military base part of Enclave or something? Sorry, I'm not good at English, smiley face, but I think that you know what I wanted to say. The question refers to the Mariposa military base that the super mutants controlled in the first Fallout and was destroyed in Fallout 2. Chris's answer is unknown. The Mariposa military base was constructed for the purposes of FEV experimentation on human beings, and considering the nature of the volunteers, military prisoners who did not have their brains scooped for use in brain bots, and the lack of any shred of ethics in the experimentation procedures, it is possible the Enclave had something to do with the experiments at Mariposa. In Mariposa records, however, the military base is never mentioned as under the direction of any organization called the Enclave, and Colonel Spindle head of the military squad stationed at the base, never indicated any Enclave allegiance, nor did Chief Scientist Anderson in the last few minutes before Maxim put a bullet through his skull. Still, the existence of a Mariposa military base was listed in Enclave records, and this enabled the Enclave to find the base and begin their excavations. So it is possible that some elements of the pre-war Enclave had their fingers in the horrors taking place at Mariposa. They held the site for many years, but abandoned it after obtaining the FEV samples, and noting the high incidence of mutation among the worker slaves and some of their soldiers, including Frank Horrigan. So at this current moment in time, there's still not a definitive answer to this question, and Chris's response is just as good as any we have today. The next question is, the boss, Richard Gray or someone, in Fallout 1 was in the vault. Which vault is it? The question is referring to Richard Gray, the man who would become the Master in the first Fallout. The vault Gray, originally Moreau, started out before his mutation into the Master was Vault 8, and the vault you find him in Fallout 1, was a test/demonstration vault constructed by Vault-Tec, and has no number, according to Chris Taylor. Thanks to Nick Garrett for letting me know about Vault 13 stash on this stuff. Here's a relevant quote. Which vault number was the Master's base? The Master was in the Vault-Tec private vault. This was the demonstration model built for the federal government. It was also very close to the Vault-Tec headquarters. The quote is an answer from Chris Taylor, who was a designer of Fallout and Fallout Tactics, and is therefore used as an authoritative source. The next question is, so Richard Gray was the first vault dweller, not the main character in Fallout 1. Why did he left his vault? According to Lynette in Fallout 2, Richard was exiled from Vault 8 for murder. The details of the murder are unknown, and judging from the hypocrisy filling Vault City, the entire incident is questionable. Chris seems to imply here that Richard Gray's exile from the Vault City may have been completely fabricated, which would be an interesting footnote in the history of Vault City. Why in the final scene in Fallout 1 and 2 nothing is said about player-friendly NPCs? I'd love to know what happened to Marcus, Tycho, Ian, Cassidy, or Vic afterwards. Chris responded with, Fallout 1, I don't know why. Tim and the Troika crew apparently ended up doing this for the NPCs in Arcanum though. Well, according to the manual in Fallout 2, written by Chris Taylor, Ian bit the bullet in Necropolis, and Dogmeat died in the Mariposa military base. Tycho and Katya are not mentioned, so it's assumed that they didn't join the Vault Dweller. Still, even though it's mentioned in the manual, I'd substitute your own experience with them and let that be the true history. Even though Dogmeat's pretty likely to bite it in the military base, because of those damn force fields, and because you can't tell him to park his doggy ass in a safe place, without locking him in a force field cage. In any event, I'll try to include alternate endings for these characters depending on what you did in the game. Your actions should make a difference. So this is something that was taken to heart in Fallout New Vegas, as the player can get ending slides that give information on the companions they chose to have during the game. Ian's official fate is as follows from the Fallout 2 manual. Following a long trek through the wastelands, the two finally reached Necropolis. Engaging the super mutants at the watershed in battle, Ian lost his life. A flamer unleashed by one of the super mutants burned him to death. The smell of Ian's burning body would haunt the dweller for years to come. The next question is, according to Chris A., the ghouls in Vault 12 were exposed to radiation and FEV. I know Harold said the vault door opened early or something, so the radiation bit makes sense. My question is, how were the ghouls of Vault 12 exposed to FEV? Harold was a special case since he went to the vats with, someone who shall remain nameless and got dipped. How do you account for the others? These ghouls referenced here are those found in Necropolis. Chris answered, when the West Tech Research Facility was hit, it shattered the FEV storage tanks on levels 4 and 5 and released the FEV into the atmosphere. Through some means, perhaps propelled by the explosion, the virus was able to meet the ghouls quickly, and the mutation process began even as the radiation was rotting away their bodies. How the virus is able to survive the blast without being sterilized is unknown. It would depend on what type of warhead cracked the West Tech facility like an egg. Actually, Harold never said he got dipped, although it's possible. He was exposed, however. Being in close proximity to FEV is enough to cause mutations, as the Enclave slaves mining Mariposa discovered. I imagine the shield between the vats and the control room in Mariposa was meant to keep the virus contained. Alright, so here we see the beginning of something that was contentious among the original development team, and that is to what degree mutations in the wasteland could be attributed to FEV or radiation. It seems fairly clear here that Chris Avallone believes that FEV has an effect on basically everything in the Fallout world, due to the West Tech Research Facility being impacted by a nuclear warhead. and releasing the virus into the atmosphere. For him, the question isn't whether FEV infected people and creatures in the wasteland cause mutations, but to what degree those mutations can be attributed to FEV. For him, it is a given that everyone has a little bit of FEV in them. The next question is, what the heck was Frank Horrigan? A super mutant in powered armor? A cybernetically enhanced human? A robot? A cybernetically enhanced robotic super mutant in powered armor? Also, if he was mutated, why did the Enclave put up with him? Did they make a distinction between FEV-induced mutation and radiation-induced mutation? Chris's answer is, Frank Horrigan is a Munchkin's worst nightmare. As far as I can find in the documentation, he's a mutant in power armor. Whether he's technically a super mutant is debatable. Since the scientists operated on him so much and tweaked his DNA and physiology, it's hard to tell what the final result would have been if he had been left to change on his own. As for being a mutant, here's an excerpt from the last update. Here Chris talks about the update where he clarifies that Horrigan never considered himself a mutant, and that maybe the scientists that worked on him did, and that a few of the soldiers may have also considered him a mutant. They didn't make a distinction as much as an exception. Not many people were aware of his mutant status or could recognize him as a mutant, and those people saw him as more of an altered human experiment than a mutant. It's all semantics and selective bigotry. For fanfiction purposes, it's also possible he was just a genetically engineered monster whipped up by the Enclave, and that's what Sergeant Granite assumes about him. When he said, "He's some genetically engineered freak is what he is. Used to be the president's bodyguard. Secret Service agent Frank Horrigan. Now he's more than half machine." So in Bible Entry 2 we covered earlier had a bit dedicated to this question that answered it well, and I think it's pretty well understood in the fanbase now. It seems, however, that it was not nearly as clear early on for the Fallout community. Chris then asks the fans a question. This is a question since Black Isle Studios is going to keep making RPGs, but some questions I've always been curious about for any of you who still play pen and paper games. When you have access to computer ones, why? Are there any special qualities about pen and paper that make you keep playing them over a computer game? Or a massively online multiplayer game? Just curious. We have a dedicated pen and paper and board game base at Black Isle, and we have our opinions, but I'd like to hear yours. If you've got some thoughts on it, feel free to email me. Chris next has a small section called Fun Links where he provides 2 links for people that may want to get old war posters similar to what can be seen in the games. I checked both links and they are both dead, so there's no need for me to show or mention them. The next section is titled Fallout 1 Archeology. Chris says the following. I'm going to try and start including all the keywords you can ask the talking heads in Fallout 1 with the tell me abouts. This may not be a complete list, but these are all the ones listed in the design documentation. There's no documentation I can find for the non-talking heads, but if you happen to know of any, or find any other talking heads keywords I missed, let me know. Let's start with the Overseer. Chip, water purifier, control chip. Vault, war, outside, overseer, library. I think these last 2 give new responses, but it could be a generic I don't know response. And because the Overseer is boring, let's move on to Aradesh, who's got a bit more spice. Aradesh, Dharma, Tandy, Raslo, Seth, Raiders, Vipers, Cons, Junktown, Spear, Guard Tower, Guard Station. So this is interesting as it seems like it could be a way to give players ways to encounter new dialogue they may not have seen before. I don't know exactly what other purpose this entry could have. The next section is a short one about Psykers, where Chris says, for Fallout fanfiction purposes, you are welcome to make use of the Psykers and their potential from Fallout 1, but I'd be careful. The Psykers in Fallout 1 show some pretty over-the-top mutations that could take the world to childhood's end faster than you could say, are his eyes glowing? In any event, of the 4 Psykers in the Master's Lair, Wiggum was electrokinetic dominant, Lucy was telekinetic dominant and a minor photokinetic, Moore was a pyrokinetic dominant, and Gideon was a receiving telepathic dominant, without the ability to control his telepathy, requiring the psychic nullifier to block incoming thoughts, with minor photokinetic abilities. In the Fallout Bible, all Psykers were officially wiped from the genre when the cathedral was vaporized in nuclear fire. It is most likely the Master was able to somehow bring forth psychic abilities in certain humans after they were injected with FEV, but most of the experiments were failures, resulting in insanity, or used to line the corridor of revulsion. I find it interesting that once again we see Chris laying another group to permanent rest, or at least what he thought was permanent rest. The psychic nullifier features again in Fallout New Vegas, where a young boy known as the Forecaster uses it to lessen his headaches, brought on by his ability to see into the future. We see characters in all Fallout games after Fallout 2 that show different kinds of Psykers, and while it could easily get out of hand, I would like to continue to see them, maybe even with some increased frequency in future games. Chris has a section named Brotherhood of Steel Disc, where he asks for help from the community. In an attempt to finalize information regarding the Brotherhood, he needed verification that a .msg file he had was actually implemented in the game. The file reads as follows: Brotherhood of Steel Honor Code, Maxon's History. My father was a security guard at a secret military base in the desert of Southern California. A typical MP, I remember mostly his strength. When it came time for the revolution, I respected his convictions. He stayed behind to help those who were disabled and wounded, even the size. He put the well-being of myself and my mother into the hands of his best friend and ordered us into the desert with the other rebels. We, very few, marched into the wastes. The only thought on my mind was that I would never see my father again. He knew that to stay behind was death, and still, he stayed. He respected the flag, the CIC, and the badge that he wore. What an idiot. He died for the sins of others that will never happen again to us. We will become self-sufficient. We will become keepers of knowledge and lore. We will survive the end of civilization. We will take responsibility for our actions, and we will hold accountable the actions of others. This I pledge to you, Maxon, my son. The Brotherhood of Steel is justly named. We are a brotherhood. Unlike my father, we will stand back to back with those that share our convictions and beliefs. We are steel. We are hard. We have been sharpened to an edge. Always remember the fires that we were forged in. Never forget. The motto from a previous time and our motto now. The final section is an attempt at a timeline, where Chris made a bunch of changes due to feedback from the community. The updated timeline is not as simple as a few additions. Chris added new entries, changed other entries, and completely deleted many others. So I'm going to try and do my best to communicate the meaningful changes. 2055, the organization previously called the FSEF is changed to WestTech and reads, the WestTech Research Facility starts working on a new virus to kill the new plague. Their viral research and close ties to the federal government eventually lead them to being chosen for the Pan-Immunity Virion project 20 years later, as well as power, infantry armor, and laser research. It is to be expected that names change as the development progressed, but I have to wonder what the original acronym of FSEF stood for. Give me your best guesses in the comments. In 2055, Zax 1.2 is brought in to regulate things at WestTech. Chris added this, and I thought it was too funny to leave out. In the meantime, it calmly calculates data and plays chess with the scientists. Many scientists claim that Zax is a big old cheater and draws the game out too much for a computer of his considerable abilities. Chris removed the 2057 entry that mentioned that a strain of FEV is tested on animals. Chris removed a 2060 and 2062 entry that mentioned that FEV was being tested on apes. The second entry that mentioned scientists discovering that FEV is carried by the bloodstream and seems to eradicate all imperfections and fill in the gaps in DNA is also deleted. It is instead replaced with, despite quarantine measures, the new plague continues to spread, fueling national paranoia. FEV's ability to heal mutations and gaps or errors within DNA seems counter to what we know about FEV and could be why this entry was removed. In 2063, a portion specifically about Vault 13 was added, reading, the construction of most vaults completed, except for Vault 13, whose construction finally gets off the ground, heralding a development cycle that seemed plagued with problems. 2069, Vault 13 is finally completed. It is the last of the vaults, and drills begin. Due to its late completion, the cry wolf effect that hurt the other vaults is not as pronounced. Between 2071 and 2077, many changes were made. Chris removed all references to the incident where animals being tested on with FEV broke out and killed scientists. The entry that referred to FEV tests on small towns, resulting in deformities and insanity of the inhabitants, is also removed. These entries were replaced with 2073, As China becomes increasingly aggressive with their use of biological weapons, the United States government felt that a countermeasure was needed. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project, PVP, is officially formed and plans are made to begin experiments at the West Tech Research Facility in Southern California. 2075, PVP experiments continue at West Tech with batch 10-011, in the wake of successful tests of the virus on single-celled organisms. Experiments on plant cells are postponed. The Pan-Immunity Virion is renamed FEV, the Forced Evolutionary Virus. In May, FEV experiments continue at Mariposa with batch 10-011. In the wake of successful tests on flatworms, the flatworms exhibit increased size and heightened resistance to viral contagions. Experiments with insects have less success, and further experimentation on insects is postponed by Major Barnett. In June, FEV experiments continue at Mariposa with batch 10-011, with white mice as subjects. Increased size, muscle density, and intelligence are noted. November, FEV experimentation, batch 10-011, on rabbits is concluded. Increased size, intelligence, and, this time, aggressiveness is noted. Apparently, it was too hard to determine whether the flatworms in the previous experiments were angrier and more violent than normal. Frankly, the researchers cannot be blamed for this. A military team under the command of Colonel Spindle is sent to the West Tech Research Facility to monitor the experiments in the interest of national security. Captain Roger Maxson, the grandfather of John Maxson, the High Elder of the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 1, is among the team personnel. Later in January, splicing in several new gene sequences into their test virus, dogs are injected with batch 10-101A at Mariposa. Although increased strength was noted, increased intelligence was not. 2076, July, FEV research leaked to the world, raising tensions even further and causing many countries to withdraw support for the United States. FEV is carried back to the secret base, and all records of the project are ordered destroyed. New blackouts begin. He amended it, saying that the presence of FEV was leaked through an unknown source to the world. Then he added these entries. Using batch 11-011, experiments were conducted on raccoons. Some results are noted, but the attempted escape of several infected raccoons causes Major Barnett to terminate the escape. And the test subjects. 2 pairs of raccoons, however, are unaccounted for. Note, Scott Campbell and Chris Taylor intended these escaped raccoons to form an intelligent animal community northwest of the globe called the Burrows. This location was never implemented. April. Once all secondary tests and studies are done on the test subjects, all dogs from batch 11-101A FEV tests at Mariposa are terminated from a safe distance. October. At West Tech, 15 chimpanzees are infected with batch 11-111. The most successful test to date, growth and immunities in the chimpanzees surpass all other subjects to date. The military practically drools over the results. Plans are made in secret to begin testing in small quarantine towns in North America, and the Mariposa military base construction is sped up in anticipation of moving the West Tech project to a location under military supervision. 2077, January, Major Barnett orders transfer of all FEV research to the newly constructed Mariposa military base, despite objections by the research team. I'm sure many of you know about the cut intelligent raccoons. It is not clear whether the lore stands on this event in the timeline. Personally, I think Rocket Raccoon should stay with Marvel, but that's just me. These entries were added too. 2077 October, Captain Roger Maxson and his men discovered that the scientists at Mariposa had been using military volunteers, military prisoners who didn't have their brains scooped for use in brain bots, as test subjects in their experiments. Morale in this base breaks down and Maxson executes Anderson, the chief scientist. Not long after this, and in light of the mental breakdown of Colonel Spindle stationed at the base, Maxson's men turn to him for leadership. He shrugs and says, "We should quit." Later in October, Captain Roger Maxson, now in control of Mariposa, declares himself to be in full desertion from the army via radio, and nothing happens. Worried, Maxson orders all families stationed outside the base moved inside the Mariposa facility. October 25th, 2 days later at Mariposa, a scout in power armor, Plattner, is sent out to get specific readings on the atmosphere. He reports no significant radiation in the area surrounding the facility. October 27th, after burying the scientists in the wastes outside of Mariposa, the soldiers seal the military base, then head out into the desert, taking supplies and weapon schematics with them. Captain Maxon leads his men and families to the government bunker at Lost Hills. This event was called the Exodus, and the surviving soldiers went on to eventually form the Brotherhood of Steel. Note, although Maxon's points in his holodisk indicate that civilian personnel, presumably families of the scientists or other civilians not associated with the military, were to remain at the base, whether they did or not is unknown. The Brotherhood's timeline changes a bit between this timeline and the previous. In the first timeline, the Brotherhood killed the scientists and sealed off the Mariposa base in 2080, and the Brotherhood was formed immediately after. These events now happened a few years earlier and have more details as well. Chris changed the year that Harold left Vault 20 from 2096 to 2090. Several events are shifted back, including Harold's rise to Caravan Boss and the birth of John Maxon, the future High Elder of the Brotherhood in Fallout 1. Chris explicitly states that Harold and Richard Gray team up to find out the source of super mutants that are decimating caravans in 2102. These events are added between 2102 and 2120. 2102, June. Harold, already mutating, is found by traders and taken back to the hub. His former caravan partners and employees, horrified by his condition, abandon him, and he is soon left without even 2 bottle caps to rub together. July. Richard Gray, now horribly mutated by the virus, crawls from the vats covered with FEV and in terrible pain. Barely able to think or perceive his surroundings, he crawls into the vat control room and begins his audio log. He fades in and out of consciousness, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. July through November, Richard Gray begins to acclimate to his condition and begins his first tests of animals by exposing them to FEV. These experiments and his growing awareness lay the foundation for his plans for the Unity and the Master Race. He takes the name The Master. November, the first human victim wanders into Mariposa, and Gray consumes him. December, Gray continues his experiments on wanderers that enter Mariposa, with no success. The creations are flawed due to the radiation counts in their bodies, making them big but incredibly stupid, and Gray consumes them rather than letting them live. 2103, the Master discovers the problem with the influence of radiation on his mutations, and he begins to choose his subjects more carefully. The first classic super mutants are born, butt-scratching animations and all. He begins his plans to build an army. 2103 to 2130, throughout this period, the Master begins slowly gathering test subjects, willing or unwilling, from local human stock. The Great Winter of 2130 and the scarcity of human subjects make building his army difficult. Next, 2131 to 2135, the Master begins ordering his super mutants to gather human stock from caravans. For many years, the caravan disappearances are blamed on monsters in the desert, and even when the abductions begin to occur on hub caravans, the Deathclaws are blamed. The super mutant army grows. 2134, led by Sergeant Dennis Allen, a small team of the Brotherhood of Steel head to the West Tech research facility in search of technological artifacts. They arrive there 20 days later, and are promptly chewed apart by the West Tech's unforgiving automated defense systems. Wounded, Allen begins to suffer radiation poisoning from a leak in his suit. Before he dies, he logs what happened to the expedition into a holodisk, then goes to join the Brotherhood in the sky. Chris then removed the following entries. 2135, FEV2 research completed. Master begins gathering test subjects, willing or unwilling, from local human stock, usually caravans. The first super mutant emerges from the vat during this year. For many years, the caravan disappearances are blamed on monsters in the desert, and even when the abductions begin to occur on hub caravans, the Deathclaws are blamed. 2151, the Brotherhood of Steel sends a group out to find what happened to the Brotherhood exiles, but finds only ruins in the wasteland and no survivors. 2155, John Maxon's father dies in a raid by the Vipers. Expecting the raiders to break and run, Maxon doesn't take into account the religious ferocity of the Vipers or their poisoned weapons, and when a single arrow nicks him with his helmet off, he dies within hours. John Maxon takes up the role of Elder, and Rhombus becomes the new lead of the Paladins. Chris adds several entries after 2161. 2161. A Brotherhood of Steel patrol comes across a dead super mutant in the Badlands. They take the corpse back to the scribes, and head scribe Vree begins her examinations of the super mutant. December, Vault Dweller recruits Dogmeat in Junktown. 2162. In January, Vault Dweller reaches the hub and negotiates with the water merchants to deliver water to Vault 13, buying the vault some time. February, Vault Dweller recovers the water trip in Necropolis. Ian is killed by a super mutant and reduced to a cinder, ending his tendency to shoot the Vault Dweller in the back with SMG bursts. Amen to that. April. Vault Dweller destroys the military base. Dogmeat dies defending his master. 2211, Frank Horgan is born, unfortunately. 2231, Melchior's son is born. So in the original timeline, the Enclave finds the Mariposa military base in 2095, and Horgan begins mutating due to his time there. These events are changed to 2236, many years later, with the following entries added. 2236 August, Melchior is captured by an Enclave patrol and becomes part of the slave mining force at the military base. October, Melchior begins to mutate, but keeps his intelligence and cunning in the wake of the transformation, making him pretty smart for a super mutant. Realizing that the Enclave will kill the super mutants after they get the FEV data, he begins to use his magician talents to secret away weapons for the mutants to defend themselves when the Enclave decides to dispense with them. Tests on Frank Horgan, instead of happening in 2221, occur in 2239, resulting in the mutant cyborg monster we know of today. So those are the major changes that occurred between the first and second iteration of the timeline. The main improvements have been in giving more context to the formation of the Brotherhood of Steel and placing the main Enclave events later in time, which makes more sense given the events of Fallout 2.
We finally made it to the last section, which has the appended files and a section called Unused Ending Narrations. Chris explains that they wrote many lines from the narrator's perspective, who was voiced by Ron Perlman, and sometimes the voice actor for whom the lines were intended. Chris said the reason why most of these probably didn't make it was simply because they ran out of time. The lines for Lynette went as follows. The vault city that I helped establish was to outlast me and continue on for many more years. In the elections that occurred after the destruction of the remnants of the United States government, senior council member McClure was appointed first citizen, and I retired to honorary council member status. With my new free time, I traveled south to NCR and met the NCR president. I was responsible for much of the legislation that followed in the years between NCR and our city. Marcus's lines are, inspired by the example set by the Chosen One, Marcus eventually traveled across the Great Mountains to the east, searching for other refugees from the Master's army. You never heard from him again. President Richardson's is, the destruction of the Enclave erased all trace of President Richardson from history. Now the title of President is used simply as a boogeyman used to frighten children. For Harold, you still hear mention of Harold from time to time. Apparently the tree growing from his head has gotten larger, and if rumors are to be believed, fruit is growing from it. The seeds are said to be remarkably tough, and several of them have taken root even in the most barren stretches of the wasteland. The village elders is, the Arroyo elder lived for many years after the destruction of the Enclave. She seemed pleased that the ancient separation between Vault 13 and the Vault Dweller had been reconciled, and many were the times she told you she wished the Vault Dweller were alive to have seen the reconciliation take place. Certain that the safety of the new village had been secured and the new community was flourishing, the elder passed away a few months later in her sleep. Many of the older Arroyo residents believed that she now lives in the vault of the sky, telling the Vault Dweller of your brave deeds. These are comments from Matt Norton. The end movie is just finishing, the tanker sailing toward the view at full speed. In the distance is a massive explosion of the Enclave oil platform. The tanker draws closer as the screen fades to black. The Elder, the player character, and all the tribesmen are escaping on the tanker, though we do not see them. The Elder speaks in voiceover. She is pleased, even a little mischievous. Oh, did you see that? That was a good explosion. Chosen One, you are worthy of your name. I am alive, the tribe is saved, and the evil ones are dead. By the Vault Dweller, you are a hero indeed. All the village will honor you when we get home, even your Aunt Morless. We will roast a gecko and feast. There will be a shrine to you in the temple. Children will be taught your name. With you to protect us, we will certainly grow and prosper. Then it fades to black. That was a good explosion, wasn't it? I think I would like to see more explosions. Chris ends this section with this. I may include an MP3 of Ron Perlman personally wishing me dead for the end narration sequences in Fallout 2. It is both funny and frightening at the same time. I really wish that he would have come through on that promise, and we could hear the wonderful sound of Chris getting chewed out by the voice of Fallout. To cap it all off, here's the promised image that was apparently a stylized and early concept of the Lost Hills bunker. I have to say the cherubim holding guns is just perfection.
This is a long video, and I knew it would be, so I hope you listen as you have time. And if that means you have to come back several times, then that is perfectly fine. Now, let's get on to the comment highlights from my Melee Weapons Part 2 video. Starting off, many of you mentioned that Fallout 76 actually has a shovel that can be used as a weapon in Flatwoods, even with a special variant. The cursed variant has increased damage and attack rate. Sorry about missing this in the previous video. A few of you mentioned that the Machete Gladius has a design similar to the Indian Kukri, which I would say there's definitely a resemblance, even if it isn't a one-for-one representation. It also makes the naming convention even more curious, given that an Indian-inspired design was given a Roman name in post-apocalyptic America. Xavier Coggs had a cool idea in regards to the aluminum bats and the rocket upgrade, where he thought it could be cool if the hollow interior was the fuel reservoir. That would certainly solve the problem of where the fuel is stored. Although there would still be questions regarding how the rockets are activated. Not to mention, having a bat full of liquid would really change the swinging dynamics of the bat. Pignusman reminded me that I missed a few more throwing weapons in Fallout 76, that I will need to cover in my next Melee video, so expect me to mention these in the final Melee Weapons video. Britt C wrote a really interesting comment in regards to the Datura plant that I spoke about in the Chems of Fallout video. That is definitely worth a read, and he's doing my job since I did everyone a disservice by not talking more in depth about such an interesting plant. A few of you mentioned that my previous statement, that the motorcycle gas tank that is used for the shish kebab proved that it was a gasoline-powered vehicle, was a bit hasty. We do know that the nuclear-powered vehicles used coolant in Fallout, and there's not really any evidence that the tank was for liquid fuel. It could have just as easily been a coolant tank. So, I retract my previous statement, and my current stance on whether the Fallout 3's motorcycle is gasoline or nuclear-powered is an emphatic, I don't know. A few of you pointed out that the so-called scalpel in Fallout Tactics is just an X-Acto knife, and not a true scalpel. Scalpels are meant to be disposable due to contamination issues, with things like prions being especially dangerous due to their ability to survive even the most extreme decontamination efforts. 13AK mentioned that although the city mentioned by Lorenzo Cabot that was inhabited by aliens predates human civilization, humans still would have been around, and there could have been some level of interaction involved between aliens and very primitive humans. Benjamin Finley dropped some knowledge by telling me that titanium is actually not a great metal for throwing knives, since titanium loses its edge quickly but is very abrasion resistant, making sharpening a difficult process. He does say that titanium carbide would make a good blade, so either the developers made an error or they really were selling titanium knives, which wouldn't be that surprising for pre-war America. So that is it for this video. If you made it to the end, then treat yourself, because that is quite the feat. I wish you all the best, and may you walk in Adam's glow.